Hi everyone. Did you know that the Father is looking for worshippers? When Jesus met the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well, he explained, "A time is coming and has now come when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks." Let's take a look at what Jesus meant. Now we can become the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. Jesus lived what he taught and taught what he lived. So if we want to understand his teaching, we simply need to look at his life. What we need to realize is that although Jesus is God, he emptied himself of his divine attributes and became a man to be able to completely identify with us and to reveal perfect humanity to us so we can follow his example. So how did Jesus reveal the kind of worshipper the Father seeks? When we talk about worship, we usually think of it in the context of the Sunday meeting when we gather to worship God and sing worship songs. But is that what Jesus had in mind when he spoke of true worshippers? In Philippians chapter 2 we read, "And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross." Jesus demonstrated the life of a true worshipper as he lived in complete obedience to the Father, even to the point of death on a cross. The cross is the highest form of worship, and obedience is the key to becoming the worshippers the Father seeks. That's why Jesus told his disciples, "If you love me, you will obey what I command." And that's why Paul writes in Romans chapter 1, "Through him and for his name's sake we received grace and apostleship to call people from among all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith." Obedience isn't only the evidence that we believe, but it's also the key to demonstrating our love for God and how we truly worship him. You see, Paul makes it clear in Ephesians chapter 2 that before we gave our lives to Christ, we went our own way, and that the enemy was at work in our lives because of our disobedience. But now that we are in Christ, we must learn to obey God as true worshippers. As we look at what it means to be a true worshipper, I believe we can identify 3 levels of worship. The first is about choosing holiness for God's sake. What that means is that I choose not to sin because I love him and I want to please him. The problem is that we can fall into the trap of choosing not to sin for our own benefit. When we do so, our obedience is motivated by fear rather than love. For example, if I'm nasty to my wife and realize that I won't get any dinner later on, I can go and say sorry to her and be obedient to make sure I get fed. Clearly my obedience is motivated by fear of punishment rather than by considering how I've hurt her. In the same way, if I choose to obey God out of fear, then it's for my own benefit. But when I choose to obey God out of love, it is to please him. When we choose holiness for God's sake, we worship him. The second level of worship is choosing to serve others for God's sake. In Hebrews chapter 6 we read, "God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown him as you have helped his people and continue to help them." When we choose to serve others for God's sake, we worship him. Of course, we can also fall into the trap of serving others for the wrong reasons. If we rely on being noticed and acknowledged for our obedience, then our obedience is for our sake and not God's sake. But when we serve others to please the Father, then our obedience becomes true worship. That's why Jesus taught his disciples not to be like the Pharisees who lived for the praise of men rather than serve others to please the Father. When we choose to serve others for God's sake, we worship him. The third level of worship is choosing the cross for God's sake. Jesus demonstrated the life of a true worshipper as he lived in complete surrender to the Father's will. That's why he could say in John 17, "I've brought you glory on earth by completing the work you gave me to do." Jesus worshipped the Father as he only lived to do the Father's will. In the same way, the Apostle Paul lived as a true worshipper and could write, "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." There are many wonderful examples of men and women of God who chose to give up everything to serve God and his purposes. They didn't consider their lives their own and chose to surrender everything to God to be available to do his will no matter the cost. The cross is the highest form of worship, and when we choose to lay down our lives for God, we become the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. The Father is looking for worshippers, people who choose holiness for God's sake, people who choose to serve others for God's sake, and people who choose the cross for God's sake. How about you? Are you the kind of worshipper the Father seeks?